Nothing raised. The annual budget. And at this stage, I will call upon the Chief Executive, Mr. Jim Stubbock, to introduce this item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to introduce this morning's item and provide some context for the discussion. I'll welcome the finance team to the table, who I'll hand over to in a minute. This, of course, is a procedural report, and it includes an update on the current financial projections for the Auckland Council Group and the process relating to the annual budget for 2023-24. This is a standard process for Council, given we're required to prepare and adopt a budget each financial year. However, of course, it is not standard or usual to be faced with the economic conditions that we find ourselves in, conditions that are severely impacting Council's financial forecasts as they are impacting businesses across the country. Inflation is at the highest level it's been in many decades, and this year alone we've already seen the Reserve Bank increase interest rates 6 times, the official cash rate 6 times to try and bring inflation under control. Historically, Auckland Council's general rates increases have been around 1 to 2 percentage points above the Consumer Price Index as a measure of inflation. That's been the case for all of the existence of Auckland Council since the time of amalgamation. That's been adequate to balance the operating budgets and provide sufficient capacity for capital investment program that supports Auckland's growth. But we are seeing now inflation above 7%, which is more than double the agreed rates increases that were increased rates that were agreed in the LTP. The long-term plan. It is important to note that Auckland Council is, of course, neither the cause nor the solution in terms of the cost of living crisis. However, we must be prepared to respond to it. We signalled at the last budget that the financial storm clouds were on the horizon. While last year's budget decisions included using $127 million of better off funding to reduce the immediate pressures, we also prepared several mitigation strategies to address the systemic and ongoing funding gap, which at the time we estimated to be between $90 and $150 million. Considering the use of these options to address the operating budget pressures over the focus of the annual budget for next year is the process that we're embarking upon. And in doing so, we need to make sure that we don't just focus on solving the immediate short-term problem, but that we make changes that will be enduring and not create more challenging circumstances later on. Staff, our finance team, will continue to provide advice on both the short and long-term implications of different mitigation options and strategies, and seek your feedback in the days and weeks ahead and responses through workshops ahead of decision-making in December. It's important through these discussions that we provide the Mayor with the broadest possible range of options to help with and inform any mayoral proposal. And to that extent, I would encourage all councillors to engage in those deliberations constructively, openly, and with a view to retaining as many options as possible. With that, I'm going to hand over to the finance team, who are going to provide more detail on the context and the process, and I'll introduce Peter Gudsell, the Group Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, councillors. As Jim mentioned, this is a process report and has a noting recommendation, and this is our first opportunity to update you on current financial projections following the election, although I'm sure you're aware of the operating gap we now face. I'll take the short report as read, but we'll walk through it. So as noted in our report, in its annual budget 22-23, the Council advised it would need to address further adverse impacts of higher inflation and higher interest rates in future years, as these factors were uncertain. It was estimated at that time that the ongoing operating gap would be between 90 and 150 million per year, and noted an incoming council would have a range of options and budget levers available to mitigate this. This gap and the reasons were well signalled in that budget. As it happens, inflation and interest rates have risen higher and more rapidly than independent economic forecasts projected at the time the budget was prepared. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this change, inflation was forecast in the budget to peak at 5.2% and then track downwards relatively quickly, but it is now forecast to have peaked at 7.3% in the year to the end of June 2022 and also to remain high throughout 2024. Interest rates are now also forecast to be higher, reflecting the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's response to inflation. Since the beginning of our current financial year, the market interest rate for a 2-year term has increased by around a third. As another example, the 2-year swap rate was 3.9% in January and was 5.3% on Tuesday. These two pressures of interest rates and inflation are primarily the reason why, as of late October, the total ongoing operating budget pressures for 23-24 are estimated to be around 270 million. As Jim has indicated, Council continues to have the financial flexibility to respond to the budget situation, but tough and fast choices and trade-offs about the mix of budget levers will need to be made given the scale of the challenge. These additional choices and subsequent decisions need to not just solve for the short term, but also need to move the Council towards long-term financial sustainability. The flexibility we have to respond is through levers set out in the report, such as prudent use of debt, the level of general rates increases, asset ownership options, and changes to operational expenditure, which could affect services. There are many ways these levers can be combined to address the estimated 270 million operating challenge for 23-24. The different approaches will have different consequences, and some will provide more sustainable and enduring benefits in future years than others. Finance staff will provide free and frank advice on a mix of levers and will be guided by the following criteria. Firstly, maintaining confidence in the Council's financial management with investors, credit rating agencies and other external stakeholders. Second, helping create enduring solutions for ongoing budget pressures and moving the Council towards long-term financial sustainability. Third, not imposing too high a burden on ratepayers or creating unacceptable shocks for them, either in the short or the long term. And finally, being able to be implemented within the required time frame. As Jim mentioned, we will continue to provide you with advice on mitigation options, as well as supporting the development of any mayoral proposal. So that's a quick wander through the first part of the report, and I'll now ask Tamsin to talk about the process for the annual budget.
Kia ora, thank you, Peter, and tēnā koutou katoa, Mayor and Governing Body members. So this meeting marks the beginning of the process for developing this annual budget for 2023-2024, and this meeting today will be followed by a Governing Body workshop. So the procedural report on the agenda for today sets out our legal and statutory obligations relating to this process. So that's primarily that we must adopt an annual budget for each financial year or prepare and adopt that budget. The first milestone related to the development of this annual budget will be on December the 15th, when we ask you, Governing Body, to agree to any mayoral proposal and items for consultation. Between now and then, staff will prepare advice based on any direction we receive from the Mayor, as well as input we receive from members of the Governing Body through workshop discussions. Once decisions are made on those items for consultation, in December, staff will then prepare consultation material for adoption by the Governing Body in February 2023, and that will support public consultation with Aucklanders. For any proposed options that require an amendment to our long-term plan, a detailed statement of proposal will be needed to be prepared, and then it will need to be audited by Audit New Zealand prior to the Governing Body adopting that consultation material and consultation commencing. Further key dates in the process are set out in the report on today's agenda. We are happy to respond to any questions members might have relating to this procedural report, noting we will have an opportunity for further discussion on the budget in the workshop scheduled later today. Ngā mihi kia koutou, Mayor and governing body members.
Address from you guys?
Nothing further. Happy to take questions.
Eh? Any questions? Daniel, you've got a Councillor Newman.
Good morning. I have read the report. Thank you for the presentation. Perhaps you might want to address it now. Can I ask, so the variance at 270 million is either, so we had the 90 to 150 at the time that we adopted the annual budget on 30 June. And the 270 million means that the variance is unfavourable by a factor of between 1.8 or 3. At what point did we realise that there was going to be that unfavourable variance?
Thank you for the question, Councillor, and through the Mayor. We've continued to monitor the process and the interest rate and inflation projections as they've come through. The information that we have for you today comes from the October release of OCR and those implications. It was obvious when we wrote the budget that this was a highly variable set of factors, and that's why the range was 90 to 150 and indicated the need that although the mitigations were in for 90, further use of operating expenditure or service might be required, and that we would keep you updated. The aspects that we're bringing to you are not aspects that aren't already abundantly clear through the media and through OCR track and inflation projections. This has been our first opportunity, based on our latest information, to bring the size of this operating gap to you based on the information at the end of October.
Follow-up, if you're relying on the OCR projections in the medium term, in 6 months' time, even if we do when we address the budget, but assuming that we didn't, what variation would you anticipate if we just continue to follow the OCR projections? Are we going to go further down from 270? I mean, what is the worst case scenario if we do nothing? And when would we expect to know that?
Thank you for the question again. I'll try and answer this as best as I can, although it's probably something that we'll get into more detail in the workshop. We take the forward projections as the best estimates that we have at the time based on the economic framework and advisors. At this stage, that does look out into the future. I don't see a situation where we wouldn't solve for the 270. So that isn't an option for us. The question around how bad can it get is really out of our control, as is the cost of living crisis. It's really dependent on the degree to which the OCR, the Reserve Bank, has to act harder than it is currently signalled. I don't have the ability to make a guess on that one, and we'll use the current estimates that we have of their forward track.
One more. Beyond the OCR projections, have you, in your medium-term forecasting, factored any contingent liabilities that would give us a further unfavourable variance, and do you know roughly what that could be?
Thank you again, Councillor, for your final question. Our contingent liabilities and unquantified contingent liabilities are identified within our annual report, and that was recently published. The existence of those is well known. We provide a commentary on the ones that we can quantify and also on those that we can't. And at this stage, to the extent that you can't, you need to maintain debt headroom to provide for any additional impost upon your budget situation.
Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, my question is to Jim Staybeck. And this is a question just for the purposes of complete disclosure. Is there any financial information at all that you're aware of that was withheld prior to the last election?
No, there isn't.
Councillor Filipina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Morena koutou katoa. What other factors moving forward around the projection, noting the $270 million that you've outlined already, plus the inflation from 5.2 to 7.3, what other factors heading into the next either 1 or 2 years will we have no control over?
Thank you, Councillor Filipina. That's a very interesting question. So the interest and inflation rates are obviously huge drivers of the cost base of the organisation. We look at, when we pull together the consolidated budget picture and forecasts, the entire makeup of expenses and revenues, and these are the most sensitive at this point. However, there are revenue streams and behavioural aspects which are only becoming apparent as we move out of COVID, which we're still not crisp on. As an example of that, the behavioural aspects post-COVID around public transport and the return to public transport, that is an unknown and a sensitivity that's been signalled before. The return to profitability, the extent to which Auckland maintains a highly desirable and livable city. So the cost and revenue bases at this point of time are quite variable, but what we have attempted to do with the identification of the 270 operating gap is embed with as much certainty as we can, though all of those factors, and point out the ones that are most highly variable.
Your Worship, just one more part, if that's okay. Has there been any information, once it's been received by you or the finance team, has any information been withheld to the governing body, especially the incoming, since the inauguration or after the election? Has anything been withheld?
I thought I'd check with my colleagues, but no. Although we have strict disclosure requirements to the NZX, which might on occasion require us to go through a process of understanding whether we have to release at the same time, even though we have that, there hasn't been anything that I am aware of that I've held back or have not told councillors about.
Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of questions. So just for the purposes of clarity, this $70 million fiscal hole, this doesn't factor in any potential increase in cost to the CRL, does it?
Good question.
That is correct, Councillor Henderson. At this stage, we're not aware of what any additional cost or timeframe might be for CRLL. I would point out that that's likely to, and I peripherally answered this with Councillor Newman's question, require us to maintain some debt headroom for the extent that anything was required in that space. And as I'll reiterate, I do not know. And as such, I've not held anything back. If I do know, then it would have to become a disclosure item for me. To the extent that CRL requires additional investment, that is likely to occur at the end of the time frame of its current spend profile, and as such would not be within this 23-24 year as a cash implication or an operating cost implication.
Thank you. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. I've read the paper. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you also, Councillor Henderson, for your question about the CRL. I thought it was very, very pertinent.
That's mine too.
Yes. In the report, I'm just referring to clause 25 there, and it talks about one of the levers there, Peter, being the debt lever. So in terms of our debt, so often when we decide to increase our debt levels because we've got some headroom, that is done under the understanding that it's good to do that because future generations can pay for those assets over time into the future. But my understanding, because this is an operational budget, that we're only paying interest, we're not paying any principal, for want of a better word, off on our borrowings. So my question is around how, is my understanding correct that we are not planning for future generations to actually pay off our borrowings, and in conjunction with that, right now, today, we're not actually paying off any borrowings from previous generations or since the start of the Super City. I just want to clarify that, Peter. Is my understanding correct there or incorrect?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Sayers, and through the Mayor. It's a very interesting question, and it goes to the heart of why we use debt to fund our assets, and that is really a time shift advantage. It brings forward the opportunity to create the investment and spend that is then enjoyed by the next generations over, say, 30 or 50 years for your horizontal infrastructure, say. And then the generations that are enjoying that pay that over that time. The degree of on spend and payback, I think we should really focus on the degree to which we're funding depreciation, and the degree to which we're funding depreciation is currently at around 80 to 85% as broad figures, and we want to take that to 100% and have committed to do so by 2028. Once you have fully funded depreciation in place, then you are renewing and replacing as appropriate over time from an even base, and you're also spreading that cost into generationally to create that equity over those generations. The other aspect on debt, which I think is quite important, is to bring out that the current level of our debt ceiling at 290% is one which is supported by our credit rating agencies and maintenance of our high credit rating at AA for Standard & Poor's, S&P Global, and AA2 for Moody's. So it's an appropriate level of debt at this point.
Thank you. No further questions.
Councillor Watson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a question on some of the quantums involved in this additional 180 million of operating shortfall. The paper makes reference to increasing inflation and interest rates, which everyone's aware of. Given that, about 80 to 90% of our debt is hedged against interest rate fluctuations, what is the component of that additional 180 million that is made up of the rise in interest rate?
Yep, so you're quite right that about 80 to 90% of our debt is hedged. So it means we've effectively locked in the interest rates on a large portion of our borrowings, but not all of it. And as Peter has said, rates have moved up so rapidly, about a third increase since earlier this year. And so that 10% on a large 11 billion debt book is quite large. So that's added in about 40 million of that 180 million extra increase. Around 40 million of that is extra debt. 40 million on the unhedged. But if we hadn't have the hedging in place, it would be significantly bigger than that, in the hundreds of millions.
Okay, and just a follow-up question in respect of some of these budget levers or remediation that could take place. It's mentioned here non-rates revenue. Is there anything being anticipated there other than just putting up costs of council services? So are we looking at any more imaginative or different options there as opposed to just the one that's really mentioned here to do with pricing of council services?
I might just, if I could respond to that, Councillor. There is, of course, much more information we can provide on both the drivers of the 270 million, what the components are that have led to that number, as well as all of the potential responses to it. and that they are really the subject of our workshop that's proposed later on today. So the purpose of this report was really just to table the process that we have to go through, to signal the context around it. There is, of course, and there will be many questions around what our potential responses will be, and that's proposed to be the content for this afternoon.
Okay, so I guess in the interim, what I'm signalling is that there's probably members of the public who are interested in what our response is going to be, and today might have been an opportunity to signal that in the open meeting, hence the question.
I think we've got a fairly complex requirement of consultation, and so I think we'll get our recommendations, and then we'll have to consult with the public. It's not the public aren't going to not be aware of this, but I think at this stage here, we haven't. It's a requirement of the council to debate this first up, and with staff in an open manner that doesn't rule anything out, which is what the next step is. While we're at it, I think that given the size of the problem to fix, whatever we're going to do is almost certainly going to trigger an Audit New Zealand LTR process. So I can see staff members nodding over there. And so we are going to have fairly prompt responses here, because it's quite a congested process and the time isn't extendable. So we'll get through this part, and then we'll have a great big scrabble later on about what their options are. And I've got Councillor Bartley next, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. Thank you for the report. I just wanted to know how confident you are in the process to come up with the forecasts, because just to my own basic knowledge, they seem pretty way off.
So we've used the same kind of process for forecasting over the last few years. Ever since we, since COVID first hit, we've had a sort of rigorous approach to look at the best information from external forecasters. We look at what the Reserve Bank is forecasting in terms of interest and inflation. We look at Treasury forecasts. We look at what all the bank economists are forecasting. In terms of interest rates, we look at what the market pricing is and what all of the bank economists are projecting in their market outlook. So we have a process of looking at all those sources, working with our Treasury team on interest rates, working with our Chief Economist unit to kind of get some expert review over considering all of those different different inputs and coming to what we think a consensus view is. And then we have a process of working across the group, trying to gather things up, and when things are highly uncertain, like when we're looking multi-years out last year, we looked at ranges and scenarios and have tested what is the impact under different scenarios where that's appropriate. So we've got a process that kind of steps through what are the assumptions, what do we know, what's the best information out there at the point in time, and then looking at what the impacts. So it is, nobody's got a perfect crystal ball. We get the best information and do the best forecasting we can.
And I might just finish that off with agreeing with you that the forecasts have been highly volatile and variable, and so the process itself is robust, but a number of the factors that make up the outcome of that have moved in quite unprecedented ways, both during COVID and now in the post-COVID era, where we're responding, or the economies are responding to the quantitative easing that was applied during COVID, labour shortage, supplies, wars in Ukraine. The factors that are causing this volatility are quite hard to forecast. Process is fine, but the underlying variables are quite volatile.
Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Question to the officers. I'm just coming back up to speed with budgets. Just to recap, the last budget, the one the annual plan we're working on now, had a deficit of about 27 million, which was patched up with a government grant. That's what the market believes that that's more or less correct.
This current year we're in has the Better Off funding benefit of $127 million within this current year, and our expectation is to receive that. That was part of a number of the mitigations that were put in place for this year, such as continuing cost savings within Auckland Council, the first portion of a deferral of capital expenditure.
That's right. We'll just get those numbers because I like to keep things simple. So that was quite a significant hole in the budget when the OCR was, quite low. So now it's not. It's gone up. We have another crisis, but there seems to be something systemic about this problem, and post-election budget shock surprises are not exactly new. However, we certainly, but we have one here. So, can I also ask? We are projecting this this 270 million hole in the budget for 9 months or 8 months ahead, say. Is that what we're saying? Because we're talking about an annual plan that commences next July. So already we can see there's a significant, over $250 million deficit already so far. Is that deficit likely to go higher? Are you confident that it won't?
Thank you, Councillor. I hadn't quite finished my answer to your previous question, and the other items that make up this year's balanced budget are contained within the report and previous reports in the budget. In response to this question around confidence, we can only be as confident as the market, and we take the market expectations into our forecasts. I do believe that my response to Councillor Bartley does express the view that this is a highly volatile situation, and also I'd reflect back on the opening comments from both myself and the Group CEO where we discussed the need to create not just an answer for this year but also a financial sustainability over the medium term. So I'm as confident as I can be we've followed the right process, used the right inputs. I would not be confident to call in this highly volatile situation which way that might move over the coming couple of months. But we have to put a stake in the ground. We have to use the best information we have available at any point in time, and that is what we've done and what is before you now.
So could go higher. Okay. Can I just make a point about the report? I think it's given we're reporting to the people of Auckland who are going to foot the bill in the end. I think it's important that we use plain language. And if you're talking about cuts, budget cuts, let's not use Latinate words like mitigations. And if we're talking about, if you're proposing asset sales, we'll call them that rather than recycling. Recycling does sound so sustainable. But anyway, and leaving that aside, given the scale and the magnitude of this financial crisis, I'm uncomfortable with us dealing with it in this room, around this table, in secret. If it's a financial matter, it needs to be dealt with formally. If there are good reasons to go into confidential session, there are reasons set out in the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act, and the declarations we all made the other night are still ringing in my ear about that particular piece of legislation. Going into workshops routinely, and it is really bypassing that act, and I have to say I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it. There needs to be more formal ways of dealing with financial business, and indeed confidential financial business, rather than totally avoiding the act. Thank you.
Councillor Lee, thank you. I know there wasn't a question. I understand the observation that you've made. I just want to make the point that a couple of points. As the Mayor said, there will be a comprehensive public consultation process, obviously, that needs to happen as part of the consultation with the community about the budget. This first part of the process is about informing as much as possible the Mayor so that he can develop a proposal. And what we intend to do in the workshop is simply to create an environment where officers can provide free, frank and open advice to elected members, for elected members to have the opportunity to provide feedback, and for us to be confident that we won't, in those conversations, trigger, in an unintentional way, trigger any disclosure obligations that might otherwise arise. So that's the purpose of the workshop. It's not intended to bypass what ultimately needs to be a process of public consultation.
And I'm reminded by the statement, that predictions are particularly hard, especially about the future. Councillor Turner. Good on you. Councillor Foley.
Thank you, Your Worship. While I am enjoying our kōrero this morning, I totally tautoko that this is the beginning of a long process, and I tautoko the points that have been made by Your Worship and also our CE, that there will definitely be a lot of opportunity for the public to be involved in the consultation process ahead of us. I'm eager to get to the workshop because I know that we've got a lot of mahi ahead of us, lots of questions, lots of options and advice that we will get from our staff. And so, Your Worship, I would like to move that the motion be put so that we can get to that important mahi. Kia ora.
It's good of you, but there's a motion on the floor anyhow, so I've got to finish questions, and so, but thank you for that, but I'll get Councillor Darby, who's just poised.
Heed the comment of Councillor Foley, and I'll discuss it at the workshop.
Thank you, Councillor Darby.
Your Worship, it's a procedural motion. I believe it takes precedence. You can get advice from your staff.
Through the chair, at the moment there is actually no motion on the floor. It hasn't been moved and seconded at this point. Therefore, a motion to put it is out of order at this point.
But I get what you're trying to do. Thanks very much, Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a few questions just on debt and our capital spend. So if we had chosen to not put that 900 million on debt or do that amount of capital, what would our rates rise have to have been in the current year?
Okay, so if we didn't have debt, that would undermine our ability to deliver the capital program. So either you wouldn't deliver as much capital, but if you were to choose the option of to instead of using debt, use 900 million of extra rates. Our current rates bill is around 2 billion. So you're talking about a rates increase of close to 50%. So everyone paying 50% more rates to deliver the same capital program without any use of debt would be kind of the broad order of magnitude.
Thank you. My other question is, so we have to work on certainties with our budget. So the June update from the Reserve Bank was that we would have expecting inflation to be back between 1% and 3% in September 23, but then the October update pushed that up to mid-24. How flexible can we be with an expected forecast that could change, or do we have to work with the current forecast, or what if we consult and then have a pretty different forecast in February, March again?
So we've got to prepare a budget and give advice based off the best information currently available. But as we've talked about, things are highly volatile and things could be worse. Inflation interest could be higher. And so you might have to make some different decisions and more challenging decisions when you get to the end of the process. One way to, I guess, give yourselves the maximum capability to address that is when you think about consultation, have a broad range of options and have options that add up to more than 270. So you have the scope, you've got the flexibility to deal with whatever might arise.
Cool. And the last question is, I know that our staff, the union staff under the union, are tagged to CPI, their wage increases. Do we know a ballpark figure of the cost that we are bound to need for that, or is that factored into these figures?
So that is factored into these figures, and there's more information in the pack and the presentation. We can discuss more detail in the workshop. But you know, the key element of that, a key benchmark for setting those discussions with the union is what is the December CPI figure in the year preceding the financial year. So a key variable for us in terms of impact on staff cost is what will CPI be next month. So in terms of the variability in inflation between now and next month, that's a short period of time. Hopefully inflation doesn't move dramatically in the next month. Adversely. Adversely. I mean, if it moves down, great. But if it does, because we're talking about 1 month as opposed to 8 months in terms of that key benchmark rate, that reduces the uncertainty a little bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt.
Councillor Ferry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My question is really about whether the situation facing Auckland Council is unique, or whether you've talked about a lot of the variables at play here being out of our control. Is this something that other councils are facing, maybe some of our comparable councils in Australia as well, or is this something specifically unique to Auckland?
I'll make an opinion-based answer on that rather than a fact-based one at this point, because Auckland Council, due to its size, local board structure, requirement to consult, goes out before other councils and discloses earlier than others where its pressures are. But I have heard through contacts and colleagues that other councils might even be facing a greater impost than we are. But that will become clearer in a matter of time. However, across the board, all organisations and further than New Zealand are feeling the pressure of interest and inflation and the responses from central banks to try and pull inflation back, and we're starting to see some of that come through in the market commentary now as well. So certainly not alone.
Councillor Walker.
I'll leave it.
Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have just a few clarifying questions around debt. We use debt only for capital infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes, that's generally correct. There's some exceptions, like if we're giving money to someone else to build capital infrastructure, for example, technically operating because it's a grant, but it is the general principle. So we did use perhaps a little bit more debt in terms of the emergency budget when you had one-off shock. So there are some exceptions, but by and large, the vast majority of debt is used for capital investment for long life assets.
The alternative to using debt to fund intergenerational capital infrastructure for the city means a rate increase. Under the current debt, that would be a 50% rate increase approximately. Is that correct?
Broadly, yes. So you could look to fund a whole lot of capital investment by putting up rates now, which means current ratepayers would pay much higher rates, and then ratepayers in the future would enjoy the assets and have a lesser rates burden perhaps.
If councillors choose to reduce the debt of this council, then they would need to stop projects, capital infrastructure for the city, for coming generations. And of course we would not have rate increases. So using that model of reducing debt, not taking on more debt, holding down rate increases, we would stop building capital infrastructure for the city. Is that correct?
That's broadly correct, unless you can find another way to get capital, asset sales, for example, or those kind of things. So you've got a limited range of choices and options, some of them discussed in the paper, around debt, rates, assets, capital expenditure, non-rates revenue, partnership with central government and others. So you've got a limited range of opportunities, but broadly, if one of the opportunities, such as use of debt to invest in assets, is off the table, all those other levers have to work a lot harder.
My last question is, what is our debt in ratio to the value of our capital assets?
I can't do that quite in my head, but at the end of 30 June, 11.8 for gross debt and 70 billion of assets was the point at that time. The one that the credit rating agencies look at more fully is the debt to revenue ratio, but that's the ratio of debt to total assets.
Thank you.
I might add that the debt to assets in a meaningful way is the debt to tradable assets, which is not nearly as rosy as the debt to total assets.
Do we know what that is?
That would be difficult to define. It would be incumbent on councillors' choices on what they saw as tradable assets.
Okay, have I got...
Councillor Turner has a question now.
Oh, Councillor Turner.
Sorry, the one lever that isn't being talked about here is productivity. You know, all the budgets I see out there, all the pricings, council's construction costs are under 50% of the total cost. And peer review and external consultants often takes 50% of the costings. Council staff go through a rigorous recruitment process and they're paid well for their specialist abilities. Why can't we start cutting some of those external costs?
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Your Worship. We do have operational expenditure as one of the items within there, and certainly it mentions efficiency targets and looking to achieve over and above those. And indeed, taking a balanced approach to this, as Ross has indicated, if we don't use one lever, the others have to be pulled harder. Taking a balanced approach would have that come in as well.
Thank you for that. Seems to be all the questions. I'm going to ask for a mover and a seconder to note the update on the financial projections. Deputy Mayor and... All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, carried. And thank you for that report and presentation, gentlemen. Before you go, it's a sobering report. In some respects, it's a wake-up call. For me, it confirms that the forthcoming mayoral proposal and budget setting process will not be business as usual, and as I've said before, almost certainly trigger the Audit New Zealand review. Shortly, I'll close the meeting so that we can have a more in-depth analysis of the trade-offs and tools that, and the budget levers that were referred to in the report. It's that mixture of three things there, and Councillor Dalton. This separate session is a chance to have free and frank discussions, and our job is to look at the options to mitigate the impacts of the rise in inflation and interest rates, and to move council towards achieving financial sustainability, not just for next year, but for the long term. Before closing the meetings, I want to encourage everyone here not to rule out anything, in or out. We've got to be open-minded to everything before we're at the start of the process. We need to listen to the advice from others, test options, both with the public and debate amongst ourselves. But the real work starts today, and we have a lot to do to meet our statutory time frames. The clock is ticking. There is another item. The